Thank you.
Yeah.
While studying at the University of Rochester, I did a lot of work at the Georgia Museum, and while I was there, what I specialized in was digital preservation. So I worked a lot with the magnetic tape collections there, LTO tapes. My advisor is here, so I would love working with him. And also, during my second year, during my master's, I worked as an intern here at the Strong under Lindsay Carano, who you might meet while you're here, for just about a year. And piracy and preservation, the relationship between the two, was one of the subjects I discussed in my thesis, Safe State, What Electronic Game Preservation Can Learn from Film Archives. And this thesis was essentially a combination of my experience in my master's program and my internship, and kind of bringing what I learned towards the film of electronic game preservation. And I'm also currently the manager of the Drive-In Theater at the Georgia Museum down the street. So first of all, what am I not arguing in this presentation? I'm not taking any sort of ethical stance at all. I don't care whether piracy is morally correct or not. That has nothing to do with me. I'm also not making a legal proposal. I'm not saying piracy should be legal, piracy shouldn't be legal. I'm also not suggesting some sort of political theory about, the goods of piracy for society or not. All of that is not within the scope of my argument. What I am arguing is, I'm just going to assume that these laws around piracy, these pretty strict laws, they're not going to change anytime soon. We can't really do anything about that at the moment. And so how should archives operate right now in light of that assumption? And I'm also assuming that preservation isn't just having the stuff. Just because you have something does not mean it's being preserved. I'm going to have a pretty strict definition of what preservation is. And so basically what I'm suggesting here is a sort of rhetorical correction. And so why is a correction needed? Well, because if you look online, where all the popular discourse around video game preservation is happening, you see a ton of discussion like this. That's basically like, well, studios aren't preserving their games, they don't want you to play their games, and so you need to pirate them to play them, which is fair enough. But then a lot of these arguments take the next step and say that, well, piracy is our only form of preservation for video games. That's the only option. And you can see a lot of discourse online. Vimslayer, this very famous website, their tagline was preserving the classics. And Anna's Archive, which went up after LibGen got taken down, it's like free textbooks and stuff online. And on their frequently asked questions page, they state some pretty lofty goals. They say that their goal is preservation, backing up all knowledge and culture of humanity, and access, making this knowledge and culture available to anyone in the world. So you can see a lot of rhetoric around why piracy is preservation in some people's eyes. And Anna's Archive uses this term, preserved forever, but as we saw recently with Vimslayer, which is like one of the longest standing sites to download ROMs from, they had to remove tons of their games. They buckled under pressure from Nintendo and Sega, understandably. And we're seeing all the time that people who host these sites are getting taken down or prosecuted. So Kim.com, he was prosecuted a long time ago, but he's being extradited to the US as of I think last week. He's the founder of Mega Upload and Mega Sites. So there's this video called Physical is Not Preservation. It's a similar title to mine. At the end of this video, he says, fan efforts are currently the best solution we have, despite it being legally questionable. And I think this is a really great statement to kind of encapsulate what popular discourse is around this. This is kind of popular consensus about, well, preservation is not really possible except for through piracy and fan-based solutions. So that's all we have. And you can see the top comment is video game piracy equals preservation. Sad but true. So it's kind of a resigned, this is all we have, I guess. And compare this to, if you just look up stuff about film preservation, well, these are documentaries about working professionals in the field. These are people who are trained, this is their full-time job, they're paid to do it. So imagine, I want to be a video game preservationist. I look it up and, oh, well, I guess I just need to, upload things to Mega or, that's all I really have as an option. And then you look this up and you're like, oh, well, I could become a trained archivist. There's a big difference here. And I think it has a lot to do with rhetoric. So we need a place that is not solely motivated by users seeking content. If that's all that it's based around, there's going to be a lot of biases on what gets preserved. We also need a place that's not actively being pursued by legal forces, in my opinion, not because I'm making a moral condemnation, just because it's really difficult to do preservation when you're being prosecuted by the US government. We need a place that's not profit-driven, and we need a place that's staffed by fairly compensated professionals, when this is not just a volunteer position, and when it's also not a criminal act, and you're being fairly compensated. I think it makes a huge difference for ensuring that these things are going to be preserved with proper standards. And we also need a place that I think occupies physical space in the world, that we know this place is going to stay here for at least 200 years or so, and we know that things are going to be there. So that's an archive. We need an archive. And this isn't a pipe dream. Film archives didn't used to exist. They didn't really come about, the 1910s or 20s. You had some of the first ones, like the 1930s. And in America, it was actually quite delayed. A lot of the first archives came around with the 1950s. But now today, that's on the right, you can see the National Audio Visual Conservation Center in Virginia. This is an entire gigantic building with state-of-the-art technology. It's well-funded. That place exists basically solely for film preservation and audio preservation. They also, interestingly, do have video games. As far as I know, they still do not have anybody full-time employed working on those. So that's kind of telling. But this isn't a pipe dream. Like, we could have places like this for video games, and I know a lot of people here are working at places that are trying to do this. So to prepare for the future of making these archives for electronic games, let's look to the past. Even though video games are really unique, there's a lot of interesting things you need to account for with video games that you don't with film. We still don't have to start from scratch. So the principles of film archives can still apply. There's a lot of things, a lot of mistakes that were made that you can learn from in the history of film archives that can still be applied to video games. So film archives, interestingly, a lot of them grew out of private collections. And these private collections were technically illegal, so for the most part. And I'm not contradicting myself by acknowledging this. It is just simply a fact that, if you have a film from MGM and you keep it in your house, it came from a distribution cycle. That film was being shipped from theater to theater. This is largely before blockbusters, right? So it would go from theater to theater, and it would usually end up at like a backwaters town like Dawson City. And then you end up with these collections of films that are technically illegal. And so these film archives, the collections, largely for the most part, couldn't have existed without piracy, especially those initial collections. And James Card, the founding curator of the George Eastman Museum, he's pictured here, and he wrote this book called Seductive Cinema, which is like an invaluable resource on the history of film preservation. And so there's this nice quote from here, where he describes, private collectors are wary of revealing their holdings, and many of them cherish pictures known to exist only to their circle of closest friends. Their paranoia is understandable. Possession of copyrighted films by an individual who has not purchased rental rights from the corporation that made and copyrighted the films has been considered illegal, and collections of such films have been subject to seizure by the FBI. The FBI has not been shy about swooping down on private collections and carrying them off. It might be hard to picture today, but having a collection of films, like you would have the FBI knocking on your door at some point, pretty much. And this isn't that different from the situation with video games and these piracy websites that are trying to distribute video games that, as we've seen from Video Game History Foundation's reports, a lot of them just aren't available commercially. So archives for films offered a sort of legal safe space. So piracy itself is not preservation. When you pirate something, that's not at all preserving it. But these pirated materials, they can still be preserved, so it can follow piracy. And a large amount of these holdings in major film archives, they were prints that were collected illegally, like I just acknowledged. But by making it the property of our museum, you can argue for the legal grounds of cultural preservation. And so there's this way in which that these private collectors, like James Card, he was a private collector first, get transformed into film archivists. And I think there could be something similar that could happen with video games as well. And only then, once you have it at a legal place where it will be there for 100 years, for a century, then you can actually start preserving things for the long term. But archives actually also have to have trust with the studios, in my opinion. So this happened with film archives. At first, studios are kind of dubious about film archives. It's like, oh, will you tell me there's a place where I can put my films and you'll have them safely there and you won't distribute them for free? And it's like, well, yeah, but those do exist. And piracy does happen sometimes. A lot of copies were made from archival prints, but eventually studios kind of just developed a relationship of trust when it turns out, oh, this film that we have no copies of has been preserved by this archive. Maybe it's worth sending our materials there as well. So I think it is really important for archives and museums to not be torrenting stuff on their premises. I think that's important for building a reputation for yourself, because the other major donors are going to be studios, hopefully. And by building these positive relationships, hopefully you won't be just preserving the feature films, or just the commercially released video games, but also production materials and things that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. And so it's happened with film. Hopefully, it will happen with video games. And I think with film, there's security concerns back in the day, in the pre-internet days, and now I think one of the major concerns with that will arise between video game studios and archives is having proper cybersecurity. This is kind of a more speculative thing, but I really do think that cloud storage won't be great for the future of film archives or for video game institutions that collect video games. And ultimately, if you do an analysis, offline storage on LTO tape and stuff is going to be a lot cheaper. You just have to employ people who are trained for it. So let's take a second and look at, in the history of film preservation, there are different philosophies about how to do things, and I think these can be pretty telling as well for video game preservation. So, in the history of film preservation, there's these two major figures that are often pitted against each other as this dichotomy of film preservation. So on the left here we have Henry Langlois, the founder of the Cinémathèque Française, and on the right is Ernest Lindgren, the founding curator of the British Film Institute. Both very important people. The field wouldn't exist without either of them in many ways, but different methodologies. So Langlois, he always prioritized showing films. Preserving them was kind of an afterthought. He was often famous for collecting gigantic amounts of film, and it would look like he's not taking care of them just because he has a gigantic backlog and there's just all these rusted metal tins in his office and stuff. But he would show these films. He would show 5 films at a time. He'd be showing films in the stairwell while he's showing films in the theater because he just wanted people to see these films. And this actually did kind of pay off in a way. In France, there's a famous group of filmmakers called the French New Wave, and all of these guys were at Langlois' Cinémathèque, watching his films, watching classic French cinema, and that's how it built this culture of cinephilia in France. And on the other hand, you have Ernest Lindgren. So access was not at all a priority for Lindgren. The absolute priority for him was preservation, and he came from a background as a kind of English literature, kind of bureaucratic guy. Langlois was more of a cinephile, and these differences are pretty telling. So he always made sure you had a master copy, and the master copies for him meant you don't show it to anyone. You only use that to make duplicates. And those copies are just to be kept in stable condition for the indefinite future. And this really did pay off. I mean, his prints are in better condition today than Langlois. But these are both two extremes. I mean, do we really want to be collecting video games, for instance? I mean, a game by definition, I think, has to be played, right? So you don't want it to not be accessible to people. So James Card, I think, offers a kind of middle path between these two. He really prioritized making copies of things, just making duplicates as often as possible. There's this nice acronym in the archival field. I think that applies to his idea. Lots of copies keep stuff safe, so having multiple copies, having it at multiple different locations in case something goes wrong. But then also, I think what is really interesting is that he did not consider something preserved until it's been screened to an audience. So because films are meant to be shown, you preserve it by making a duplicate, making sure it's in stable condition, and then you also show it to somebody, because that's part of the nature of a film. And so I think this is a nice sort of definition that can be imported for video games. So what would preservation look like for a video game? Well, I think it would look, on paper, kind of similar to film. So you need physical storage of the object in a stable, regulated environment For film, this means below 60 degrees, below 40% relative humidity. There haven't been as many studies that I can find on the storage conditions required for video games. I think those are studies that kind of still need to be done. Image Permanence Institute at RIT did a lot of the research for film. And I think, you know, it would probably be less strict requirements for video games. But I think what's really important that hasn't been addressed by a lot of places I see preserving video games is that you need to have it in acid-free packaging. You need to have it in packaging, you know, okay, in 100 years, will this video game still be playable? That needs to be your priority, not does this video game look nice on our shelf, and should we keep it in this plastic shrink wrap so that it retains its financial value? That stuff should not matter to an archive. Like, you should be concerned about 200 years from now. And so, you know, when you keep it in like plastic shrink wrap, it's, you know, eventually going to damage the actual object. And preservation of the source code and original assets, I think, is going to be really important. I think this is going to be kind of commonsensical to a lot of people at this conference, but I mean, that's going to be really, that poses a huge difficulty that you don't have with film. And even what the source code is going to be a lot more difficult with more recently released titles. There's so many software dependencies you have to worry about. So I think preserving a piece of software, you're going to have to preserve the software dependencies. So I would like to see archives having preserved copies of MS-DOS and that sort of thing. And you also have to preserve the original hardware, in my opinion, because of researcher access, which I'll talk about in just a second. You want to present things as they were originally experienced. And obviously this is a lot of work, it's a lot to ask of people, but I think we shouldn't sacrifice any aspect of the definition and preservation for a different field just because it's more difficult and just because we don't have the funding yet. So preservation also entails researcher access. This is kind of like the James Card idea. So ensuring access to researchers, I think, should be the priority, and eventually the public. But I think, you know, one of the important things to remember is that, you know, if somebody comes to the Georgia Smith Museum and wants to watch this film from the 1950s, that's still, you know, the copyright's still held by Universal Studios, they can still watch it. You know, the studio can't stop them. They're a researcher accessing an object at a museum that's being culturally preserved. Like, they can watch it. And so this can solve a lot of the issues around, oh, these video games aren't able to be accessed. Well, if we make them available to researchers, I think that'll be really key for video game historians. And you know, there's going to be an entire generation. I'm 25 years old. I barely used a CRT monitor, so I've barely ever experienced a game on a CRT monitor, and I think that's actually really important for understanding what video games were like. And so, for the sake of research and history, I think it's really important that we preserve the original hardware. And accessibility is important, but I would prioritize preservation above that. And access that contains anachronisms, I would describe as not true access, at least for researchers. You know, the average person might just want to have fun and play whatever game, but a researcher should be able to access a historically accurate copy of something. And so for that reason, I would describe emulation not as like proper access for research purposes. So I'd also insist that a whole ecosystem is needed. We don't just need archives preserving these things. We need all sorts of other institutions. This exists for film. So publicly accessible places that maintain interest. So arcades, museums, movie theaters, all these places that, yeah, I mean, maybe they're not on CRT monitors. They're not entirely historically accurate representations of how these games would have been played, but they maintain interest. That's really important. I don't want to discredit that. And prominent figures, I think this is really key, from the industry advocating for preservation. So film preservation really took off in the 1990s, largely due to a lot of publicity. Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, all of these guys got very passionate about film preservation. They spoke up. Martin Scorsese founded the Film Foundation, which funds a lot of film preservation projects. This is really, really important, and major figures in the video game industry, I think, could play a similar role, and that could make a gigantic difference. Institutions and foundations that grant funding is really important. So, National Film Preservation Foundation is part of the US government. They grant money to people, and federally funded. Similar thing could one day exist with video games. I hope it does. And many foundations that do fund these audiovisual preservation projects might also be worth applying for funding for places that are trying to preserve video games. And you also need festivals and conferences like this one. And then also, ultimately, I think you do need, we'll need a program that trains people to be video game archivists, just like I was trained to be a film archivist. We need that place that will actually professionalize this field, and you can get, qualified professionals from this institution. And then, so finally, I would also like to address piracy. I think is also worth preserving in its own way. So an interesting example of this would be Kim's Video in New York City. It was this kind of infamous video store that had insane amounts of films that you could not access otherwise. It was kind of like the real life equivalent of Films Later, or like an in-person equivalent. And these films, a lot of them are still not available. And so these pirated copies are the only copies left. And so there's an interesting documentary called Kim's Video that's all about how it ended up here. But it's worth preserving, I think, also the history and culture of piracy. I think it's actually really telling about the culture that surrounds a medium. And I just do want to also acknowledge it's always going to be more complicated. It's only going to become increasingly complicated. There's a website called Does It Play, where you can type in a video game and see if you could put it into your console and play it without an internet connection. This is makes me terrified as an archivist that things are going to become so dependent on online, and of course we're seeing online stores shutting down all the time. Support for games gets shut down all the time, so it's only going to become more complicated. So the time to start these efforts is now. So I'm really grateful for this conference. Yeah, so thank you for listening. Thank you for your time.